Please welcome Richard Glazier.
Thank you very much. My name is Richard Glazier, and I'm delighted to be performing here on the Millennium Stage, celebrating the great legacy and music of one of the great American songwriting teams, George and Ira Gershwin. The song you just heard was called I Got Rhythm, and it was written by the Gershwin brothers in the year of 1930 for a show called Girl Crazy. It saw the debuts of Ethel Merman and Ginger Rogers. Now, George loved the way that Ethel belted out those high notes in I Got Rhythm. It was one of his favorite songs. In 1924, they really did their very first musical together as a brother-brother team as George and Ira Gershwin. And the song that they wrote for a show called Lady Be Good was called The Man I Love. Unfortunately, this great song that was written for Fred and Adele Astaire was cut from the show, but became a hit in its own right. And in 1927, a radio announcer would introduce The Man I Love, and he would say, "And now, The Man I Love, written by George Gershwin and his lovely wife, Ira." Now, George and Ira were first-generation Americans. Their parents were born in Russia and came to this country during the mass wave of immigration in the late 19th century, and to build a better life in the land paved with gold and opportunity. George was born in 1898 in Brooklyn, New York. George was born in 1898 in Brooklyn, New York, and Ira was born in December of 1896. And so they were basically raised on the Lower East Side of New York. And, you know, for George, music was for sissies. He was busy playing stickball and roller skating champion of his block. But he discovered music, and a piano was brought into their tenement. And he started improvising on the William Tell Overture and drove his classical piano teacher to absolute distraction. And then he drops out of high school at the age of 15 to become a song plugger in Tin Pan Alley. Now, Tin Pan Alley was a block of publishing houses in New York from about 1900 to 1950. And vaudevillians would go from cubicle to cubicle where there were pianos, where they would hear songs played by these pluggers that they would buy and incorporate into their acts. Well, ragtime is the rage in the early 20th century. We fall in love with the jagged rhythms of Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag. And George Gershwin writes his very first instrumental solo piano composition while he's a song plugger in Tin Pan Alley at the age of 19. It's called Rialto Ripples. Now, George writes a song in 1919, not with his brother Ira, but with a man named Irving Caesar. And this song would become the biggest seller of George Gershwin's entire career. It was called Swanee, and it was introduced by Al Jolson at the Winter Garden Theater in New York. And it put Gershwin on the map, and it opened many doors for him. You know, George loved to play at parties. He was so happy playing the piano all night long for friends and family. You'd have to pull him away from the piano at 4 in the morning. And his friend Oscar Levant used to quip, "Tell me, George, if you had to do it all over again, would you still fall in love with yourself?" So anyway, because of the success of Swanee, he writes for the George White Scandals between 1920 and 1924. Now, the George White Scandals were annual reviews on Broadway in direct competition with the Ziegfeld Follies. And so George starts to really develop his skills as an American popular songwriter, writing for the White Scandals. Now, what I'd like to play for you is the hit from the George White Scandals of 1922. Now, this is before George and Ira were known as a brother-brother team, and they wanted to not publicize the fact that they were brothers in 1922. So when I look at the music, I see words, music by George Gershwin, words by Arthur Francis. Now, that's Ira Gershwin's pseudonym. Now, how did he get that pseudonym? You see, Arthur was their brother and Frances was their sister. Now, because of the George White scandals, and Paul Whiteman was the music director of the George White scandals, he envisioned more than just a popular songwriter in George Gershwin. And he created an experiment in modern music, and George created what was called the Rhapsody in Blue. And he became noted having one foot in the concert hall and one foot on the Broadway stage. Well, in 1928, the brothers George and Iris sailed to Europe. And George had met Serge Prokofiev and Maurice Ravel and was having Sacher Torte at the Café Sacher in Vienna. He met Alban Berg, and he was inspired to write what's called a symphonic orchestral tone poem called An American in Paris. And it really became really famous when Gene Kelly created a 17-minute ballet from a movie of the same name from 1951, which won the Academy Award for Best Musical. They choreographed 17 minutes of An American in Paris. And it's also very interesting to note that when Laurent Mazel, the great maestro, he took, in the 1990s, he took the New York Philharmonic to North Korea. And what did he pick to play in North Korea but George Gershwin, The American in Paris? Just a perfect choice to bring to the North Korean people. Now, in 1951, there was a desire to get this as a solo piano arrangement that was a little bit shorter than the symphonic orchestral tone poem because of the success of the movie. And everybody in America in the early 50s, 40s, and 30s had pianos in their home. And people, one person in the house would take lessons and they'd play piano, and people would sing around the piano, and that would be a form of entertainment. Well, this next arrangement that I'm going to play for you was created during that time in 1951. It's called An American in Paris in miniature. Now imagine from George Gershwin and Ira Gershwin writing The Man I Love in 1924, and the Rhapsody in Blue, George writes the Concerto in F, An American in Paris. In 1934, just 10 to 15 years after he was just a song plugger in Tin Pan Alley, he conceives writing an opera, one of the severest art forms known to mankind. And he reads a novel by a man from Charleston, South Carolina, named Dubose Hayward. And the novel he reads is called Porgy, and it's about the Gullah culture in South Carolina. And George writes the very first American folk opera, which the Kennedy Center just did, I think a couple of seasons ago. The Washington National Opera did it here. And and what's so interesting is that when the show was tried out here in Washington, D.C. at the National Theater in 1935, the house was segregated because you see that Porgy and Bess required an all-black cast, but the National Theater changed the policy and desegregated the theater for the run of Porgy and Bess, foreshadowing what was to come when, of course, Marian Anderson sang in front of the Lincoln Memorial at the invitation of Eleanor Roosevelt, creating quite a wonderful history. And then, of course, Porgy and Bess in the 1950s went to the Soviet Union, and they played in Moscow and Leningrad and Siberia, and the Russians opened their arms to this music. Porgy was played by William Warfield, and Bess was played by none other than Leontine Price. And it's become a staple in the Metropolitan Opera in New York, and the Metropolitan Opera wouldn't do it in 1935 because of the segregation in the house. And so it's become a staple, as I say, in our repertoire, and a cherished work in the American repertoire. And it gives us really some of the most beautiful music. And I want to play for you right now the great love duet between Porgy and Bess. Thank you. Well, I often get asked the question, why, as a trained, quote-unquote, classical pianist, have you devoted your life to the Gershwins and their era and their music? And there's a very good reason for it. You see, when I was 9 years old, I was in my Aunt Esther's home, and I discovered an old 12-inch 78 Columbia Blue Label recording of Oscar Levant playing the Rhapsody in Blue with Eugene Ormandy and the Philadelphia Orchestra. And my aunt had bought that in 1945. And when I discovered it in the 70s, I'll never forget, not knowing anything about Gershwin, taking the disc, putting it on the turntable, watching it spin around at 78 revolutions per minute, hearing that opening glissando of Rhapsody in Blue, and I was hooked. And then the following week, I saw on our old XL100 television set, you know, the kind that it had rabbit ears, and you had to jiggle and move them in just the right way to clear the snow from the picture. And on this particular day, what came into focus was a movie called Girl Crazy, starring Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. And I loved and fell in love with the voice of Judy Garland singing But Not For Me and Embraceable You. And I used to spend every Saturday afternoon with my Aunt Esther, and she would take me on these adventures. We'd go to the public library where we'd check out stacks of old sheet music, and she introduced me to people like Eddie Cantor and Al Jolson and Noble Sissel and U.B. Blake and Florence Ziegfeld and Fanny Brice and all of these great people who she had seen perform in vaudeville. After all, she was the Charleston champion of our hometown of Indianapolis, Indiana in the 1920s. And she used to love to Charleston for me in her living room to the soundtrack of Thoroughly and Modern Millie. And so, on another crazy whim of just trying to absorb as much as I can about the brothers Gershwin, my Aunt Esther suggested, well, why don't we write a fan letter to Ira Gershwin? Now, what in the heck is a 9-year-old kid from Indianapolis going to say to one of the great Americans of arts and letters? Dear Mr. Gershwin, may I please have a picture of George to hang in my room? Now, you have to understand, George died on July 11th, 1937, at the age of 38, robbing America of one of its greatest geniuses. Ira lived until 1983. And George and Ira were two halves of a whole. George was gregarious, outgoing. You have to drag him off the piano bench in the middle of the night. It would be Ira. He was a little more intellectual, very well read, and very poetic. And at this moment, we must never forget the genius of Ira Gershwin for one moment, a master of alliteration, of rhyme, of metaphor, of simile. I mean, who else would rhyme salmon with backgammon? Or my nights were sour, spent with Schopenhauer. Just brilliant Ira rhymes. And so I wrote a fan letter to Ira Gershwin in 1974, it's 1975. Dear Mr. Gershwin, I said, may I please have a picture of George to hang in my room? Where are we going to mail it? I don't know where Ira Gershwin lives. Well, my Aunt Esther says, let's mail it in care of ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, 1 Lincoln Plaza, New York, New York. Completely forget about it. 4 months later, my mom comes in with the mail. An 8.5 by 11 manila envelope. In the upper right-hand corner, Gershwin commemorative stamps issued by the post office in the year of 1973. In the upper left-hand corner, it said Gershwin, 1021 North Roxbury Drive, Beverly Hills, California, 90210. I opened up the envelope, and inside was an 8 by 10 glossy of Ira's beloved brother George from the early 30s. And what Ira had done is clipped an original signature of George's from a canceled check and gave it to me because he saved all of his brother's canceled checks from the 20s and 30s and gave them sparingly to friends, family, and admirers. And somehow my letter moved him enough to answer me. We developed a correspondence. And I want you to know all of my correspondences were answered within days of each letter because Ira was very reclusive at the end, not well, very rarely even leaving his house. And I just discovered very recently that all my letters were saved and are now on deposit at the Library of Congress here by the Gershwin room. You know about the Gershwin room where there's George's piano is there, and all the Gershwin manuscripts and the great collection that the Ira Gershwin estate has left to the Library of Congress and the George Gershwin estate. And so it just so happened, he said, Richie, they called me Richie in those days, I want you to come to Beverly Hills to meet me. Now, we live in Indianapolis. We boarded TWA L1011, flew directly to Los Angeles. My dad rented a car. We stayed at the Beverly Hilton, and I called Ira on the afternoon of April 2nd, 1975, and he told me to come over. And think about this. Ira lives at 1021. Rosemary Clooney lives at 1019. Agnes Moorehead lives at 1023. Polly Bergen lives at 1025. Lucille Ball lives at 1000. Oscar Levant lives at 905. Jack Benny lives at 1002. But I'm not name dropping. So, knock on the door. A butler answers. We see the art collection that George had accumulated in his lifetime. Modigliani, Utrillo, Picasso, Kandinsky hanging on the walls. And in the corner sat a man that was cleanly shaven, hair perfectly combed, wearing a yellow sweater with the monograms IG. And there I found myself sitting across from the great Ira Gershwin, who so fondly and lovingly remembered and missed his brother so dearly. He asked me to go over and play that Steinway that is now at the Library of Congress. And this is the song that I played for him as he sang along. It's a memory I will never forget. If you know the lyric, please sing along with me on this one. This song means so much to me because it's as clear to me now of Ira singing this song as it was when I heard him in 1975. Now, in 2010, I was playing at the Smithsonian at the American History Museum, and the PBS NewsHour did a profile about me. We went back to the Gershwin room, and I played that piano 40 years I hadn't seen it, and there I was at the piano playing for the cameras, and this is the version of Embraceable You that I played for the PBS NewsHour crew, playing that piano that had come back into my life all those years later at the Gershwin room. Now, as an addendum to the story, when I played that for Ira when I was 12 years old, he said, "Richie, I wish you lived in Beverly Hills because you could come visit me every day." And he meant every word of that. And as I left, he said, "Some people say my brother George played that piano, and Oscar Levant played that piano. And someday they'll say Richard Glazier played that piano." So that was inspiration. That's why I'm here on the Millennium Stage. That's why I've devoted my life to this music, from the inspiration. Because, you know, Ira, when he saw me when I was 12 years old in 1975, he knew that on April 15th, 2026, I'd be on the Millennium Stage playing Gershwin. That's the reason he did it. Anyway, another interesting story. I did a Gershwin show in San Francisco in 2015. And a member of the Gershwin family gave me a box and told me to open the box. And what was gifted to me, which hangs in my living room in a shadow box, is the sweater that Ira was wearing when I was a little boy. And I have a photograph standing next to Ira. If you go to my website, you'll see it. And there is the sweater with the monograms, everything. They had the sweater, they saved the sweater, and they gifted it to me. I saw 45 years of my life just flash by my eyes in a millisecond. It was the most moving, wonderful thing that ever happened to me. Now, to conclude this nice little tribute, celebrating, of course, the 250th anniversary of our great country and the American popular song and the great music of Ira Gershwin and George Gershwin, I'm going to play the complete solo piano version of Rhapsody in Blue, the whole thing that George had written down in 1924. Now, what's interesting about the Rhapsody in Blue, it's really gone on to great things, because think about this. At the, was it the, not the memorial, with the stadium in Los Angeles, the Coliseum, 1984, opening of the Olympic Games. Do you remember? 84 pianos playing the Rhapsody in Blue for the opening of the 1984 Olympic Games, representing the United States of America. For George Gershwin is the voice of the kaleidoscope of America, the voice of our people, the voice of a genius.
Thank you for joining us at the Millennium Stage. For more information about upcoming shows, please visit our website or Facebook page. At this time, we ask that you please head to the back of the seating area. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening at the center.